Hello, and welcome to this second in our video series on the Dead Sea Scrolls. In our last video, we talked about the overall discovery of these scrolls, as well as reviewed the contents that this finding contains. Without a doubt, this is one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, and some say it's the most important manuscript discovery of all time. And in this lesson, we're going to look more in depth into the community that produced these scrolls. Who were they? Where did they come from? Why did they write the documents they did, and why did they try to preserve them in the manner that they did? In doing so, we're going to look particularly closely at some of the documents that they created, especially the ominously sounding The War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. So thank you for joining with us in this second video in our series on the community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. Little is known directly about this community that made the Dead Sea Scrolls. On the scrolls that we have, there are no names included, there are no dates of composition, and there's little explicit explanation of why they were made and for what purpose. However, piecing together information from a few different sources, we're able to cobble together an impression of who these people were and why they made these documents. The three main pieces of evidence we have is, firstly, the archaeological sites themselves. There are 11 caves in which these 1,000+ documents have been located, and in addition, nearby is an ancient settlement known as Qumran. This yields some important information about who these people were. Secondly, there are contemporaneous descriptions by historians of this century, of this period, that describe such communities as likely this group that made these Dead Sea Scrolls. And lastly, we have the documents themselves, some of which were very likely created here at this archaeological site. And so we can glean some information from these religious theological documents that reveal information about who it was that wrote them and why. And putting these all together, we can come up with a fairly rough idea, at least some good guesses, as to who these people were. Firstly, the archaeological site. These caves that contain the Dead Sea Scrolls are built into the hills right on the eastern edge of the Judean desert, right where it comes up against the plain leading down to the Dead Sea. 6 of these caves were man-made. They were dug out by hand out of the hillside, and 5 were natural caves. And while it's uncertain what purpose they served other than housing these scrolls that had been put into them, it seems likely, given the large number of caves in the vicinity, that some of the people who made these documents indeed used the caves for other purposes, perhaps for sleeping, residing, reclining in the heat of the day. It's difficult to say, but there's a good chance that they were used for habitation in some capacity. Much more significantly, nearby, within 150 yards of most of the caves and within a mile of the most distant caves, is an ancient site known as Qumran. This has since been excavated by archaeologists, and they have found here a complex of buildings dating from likely about 150 BC to roughly 70 AD. This set of buildings features some notable rooms. There is a large refectory or mess hall. This is a rather large room that has some stone seats built in next to the walls. There is also a room that appears to be a scriptorium. That is a room for making documents. There are some remains of wooden tables, as well as some ink wells and other writing devices, and this, in all likelihood, was a room that was used for producing manuscripts, such as the ones that were found in the Dead Sea Caves. There is a kiln for making pottery, and interestingly, some of the pottery remains in this kiln are identical to the types of pots that held many of these Dead Sea Scrolls. Also of note is an elaborate network of baths, basins that were used for ritual baths, ritual cleansing for purification, which plays an important part in the Dead Sea documents themselves. Interesting also has been the finding of a few large jars containing coins, while at the same time there are not coins found elsewhere on the premises, including up in the caves. That's an important feature that we'll get to in a little bit. Putting this evidence together from what is found in Qumran with what is found in the caves, it seems likely that these documents, these Dead Sea Scrolls, were made here at the site of Qumran and were placed in jars that were then stored in the caves. Notably, too, these jars, many have blisters on them, on evidence of being created rather hastily. Also found amongst the site is arrowheads and evidence of a skirmish here at this site. Putting together an examination of the style of pottery, of the style of architecture, of carbon dating of the premises, of a review of the paleography, or the script of the scrolls. Putting together this evidence, it seems likely that this area was inhabited from middle of the 2nd century, roughly 150 BC, until about 70 AD, when Roman legions came through this area during the Jewish War, and probably a skirmish during that war here on this property is what ultimately ended this community. Well, we know these Dead Sea Scrolls probably came from this site at Qumran. Who were the people who lived here, and why did they make these scrolls and hide them away? These people were, in all likelihood, a member of the Jewish sect known as the Essenes. The Essenes are a group not mentioned explicitly in the Bible, but they are enumerated as one of the major schools of thought in Jewish religion at this time. We can guess that they were probably Essenes based on a comparison of contemporaneous historians of the time with the beliefs and the practices included in these Dead Sea Scrolls. Pliny the Elder, a Roman, he was a bit of a polymath, a natural philosopher, we could say. He said the Essenes were based on the west bank of the Dead Sea and north of En-Gedi and Masada, which is indeed right where we find Qumran. He describes them as a sect that has given up their possessions to live a communal life, much as a monastic community might today, to give themselves to a rigorous life of prayer and of study of the law. This description is echoed and expanded considerably by a Jewish historian of the time named Josephus. Josephus lived in the 1st century and had spent most of his life here in Judea, and so he himself had a lot of first-hand knowledge of the peoples of this area. He describes them too as being a rigorous group dedicated to prayer, to a living out of the law, and to very strict moral observance. He mentions how purification rites were of great importance to them, and gives some detailed notes about their way of life. He says they shared a common meal, and the priest would pray before the meal, that they would be served food in order, and interestingly, that they would sit while they were eating their food, which was unusual, as most people in the Roman world at this time would recline to the side and eat out of a common dish, rather than being served individual portions, as seems to be the case here at Qumran. He mentions a regular routine that they followed of waking, of work, of prayer, and of eating. And he also mentions some about the order itself. He mentions that there are overseers who take responsibility for the common fund, which is perhaps exactly what we find in the Qumran site at those few jars of coins. They could have been this common fund that Josephus speaks of. He describes a rather strict discipline within the community, as well as punishments inflicted for infractions, and he notes how important it is to this group, their books, their study of the law, which was practiced through the day, and portions of the community were designated to study the law, particular portions, so that the law was continuously studied through the 24-hour day. Josephus also describes a fairly lengthy admission process of 2 to 3 years by which interested candidates are tested and ultimately approved or denied entrance to this community based on their knowledge of and observance of the Mosaic Law. At the conclusion of their testing period, they would take a very serious oath and would vow to live out in this community many virtuous qualities, such as justice, self-control, temperance, refraining from anger. Some of these points we see reflected in the archaeology itself, including an interest in ritual purification, that is, in ritual washing, seats in the refectory at which people sat for their common meal, and the jars of coins that perhaps held this common fund. These contemporaneous historian accounts of the Essenes seems to match in several important respects the findings that have been uncovered here at Qumran as well as in the caves. Interestingly, these contemporaneous accounts also match with what is described within the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. While the majority of these scrolls are biblical or apocryphal texts, there is a section of these that are sectarian documents describing their way of life. Interestingly, the Manual of Discipline echoes many of these features of life that are described by Josephus, Pliny, and others. It involves a lengthy admission process and testing based on people's observance of the law and knowledge of the law. They would take a solemn oath. There were disciplines stated for a wide range of infractions, from falling asleep during the common meal to knowingly do something wrong, to speaking out of turn, to gesticulating with one's left hand. There were very tight strictures on behavior enumerated in this Manual of Discipline that seemingly governed this community. So too, there is discussion in this document on the maintenance of a common fund. There are descriptions for how the meal is supposed to be served and, of course, prayed for beforehand, as described in Josephus, and an overall concern with ritual purification, of study of the law, of prayer, and of following the order and the structure of the community. Because of these many points of contact, while not harmonizing perfectly with the descriptions of Josephus, Pliny, Philo, and others, there is enough in common that it seems that this Qumran community was an Essene or an Essene-like community. This group, these Essenes, were generally people who had withdrawn from the religious society of the day, being discouraged or disappointed with how Judaism was practiced at the temple and in Jerusalem. They retreated to the countryside, to villages such as here at Qumran, where they devoted themselves to a very rigorous lifestyle, perfecting their manners, their knowledge and observance of the Mosaic law. But what else can we say about this community at Qumran? Well, we can say a little bit about their history. In their commentary on the book of Habakkuk, there is included in their interpretations of this book a description of a teacher of righteousness, someone who seemingly knew an enormous amount about the Mosaic law and had a gift for prophecy, of a conflict with him and a wicked priest who stood in opposition to him and led people astray. There was seemingly a falling out when a group called the House of Absalom didn't stand up for the teacher of righteousness as they should have, and he was subsequently overcome or banished from the community. While we cannot identify with surety who was this teacher of righteousness, this wicked priest, or the man of the lie, and so forth, we get a sense that this community was inspired by the teachings of this teacher of righteousness, and being driven out from Jerusalem, they decided to establish themselves here for their religious pursuits. And we can also gather a bit about their beliefs and expectations in the provocatively titled The War of the Sons of Light Against the Sons of Darkness. This is, interestingly, a war manual contained amongst these many documents, and it describes how the groups of an army are to be arrayed, what they're composed of, the age and qualification requirements of different portions of the army. It details how they are to name their trumpets and their standards, of how they are to be blessed beforehand and how they are to worship after battle. And it also describes an expected course of military victories against various tribes in the area. This is, in all possibility, an actual war manual describing how they are to comport themselves, prepare themselves, and engage in actual battle. However, mentions to the people of darkness, the armies of Belial, of the inclusion of angels fighting too alongside the sons of the light in these cataclysmic battles, it has many similarities and overtones to apocalyptic literature, some apocalypse of what you find in, say, the book of Daniel or that of Revelation. This war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness reveals another feature mentioned also in Josephus, of an expectation of life after death, of the resurrection of a sort, of an apocalyptic battle of good over evil. And they consider themselves as in their intent to follow God and be perfect in following His commandments, to be the sons of light and the ultimate victors in this great spiritual warfare, if indeed it is meant to be interpreted spiritually. And also of note, we do find also in the Manual of Discipline mention of messiahs, that of expected anointed figures to come in the future. All this put together gives a picture of a group of 1st century BC and 1st century AD Jewish sectarians who separated themselves out of disappointment or perhaps were driven out from the religious practice in Jerusalem and at the temple. They devoted themselves to a study of the Mosaic Law and to living it out as rigorously as they could, and they looked forward in apocalyptic hope to a victory of good over evil, of a coming Messiah to give them aid, and of ultimate good standing in the judgment. And so much for the composition and the beliefs of this community. But what happened to them? And why did they store their important scrolls, which they studied daily? Why hide them away in jars and caves? Well, we do know that during the Jewish War of 66 to 73 AD, Roman legions indeed came through this region. Considering the arrowheads and burnt stones that we find here at Qumran, it seems likely that a small battle took place here. Whether the Qumran community arrayed themselves as described in the war manual, we cannot say for sure. But in all likelihood, they were defeated and overcome by the Roman legions. With probability, this was the time that these scrolls were sequestered away, and given the seriousness of their life, in all likelihood, they probably intended to retrieve them, but perhaps they were either all destroyed or driven away here at this battle at Qumran. Interestingly, however, there has also been found at the hilltop fortress of Masada, where the last Jewish stand took place, also fragments of a sectarian document that is also found within these Dead Sea Scrolls. And it's not inconceivable that any refugees from Qumran took harbor at and took part in the final resistance at the Battle of Masada. What we can say with confidence is that this community was not reinstated. After the 1st century, there is little evidence of habitation thereafter, and there also seems to be little evidence that the scrolls were attempted to be retrieved. Rather, there they sat for approximately 1900 years before they were found by Bedouin herdsmen and archaeologists in the mid-20th century. This is an overview of this Qumran community, of the contemporaneous historical accounts of the Essenes, and of information we find in the sectarian documents of these Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, giving us a good guess, a rough picture of who these people are, where they came from, and what happened to them. In our next video, we're going to be looking more closely at the other set of documents, that of the biblical and apocryphal texts, and we'll explore closely what they contain and how they compare to the biblical scriptures that we have today. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you again next week, Sunday at noon, as we publish our 3rd video, that on the biblical texts. God bless, and have a great day.